The house always felt warm, no matter how cold it was outside. In their small home, love seemed to fill every corner. 5 people made up their world. A hard-working mother who never let hardship steal her smile, a gentle grandmother who shared wisdom through stories, and 3 siblings who leaned on each other like branches from the same tree. The eldest brother, Rayyan, carried the weight of the family on his shoulders. At 25, he worked long shifts, sacrificing his own dreams to ensure the family had enough to get by. His sister, Aisha, just 2 years younger, understood his struggles. She often stayed up with him at night, quietly folding laundry while he counted their earnings. They didn't need to speak. Their bond was built on unspoken understanding. The youngest, Sammy, was the family spark. At 15, he was always bursting with energy, filling the house with laughter even during the darkest days. Their mother often joked that Sammy's spirit kept their hearts beating. Life wasn't easy. Their father's passing years ago had left a hole they could never quite fill. But despite the struggles, they found strength in each other. Rayyan had always promised to protect his family, and he took that vow seriously. One evening, Aisha came home looking troubled. Her usually bright face was clouded with worry. Rayyan noticed immediately. "What happened?" he asked, setting his work aside. "It's nothing," she replied, trying to smile. But Rayyan knew better. He pressed her until she confessed. A misunderstanding at her workplace had led to accusations that weren't true. Some valuable items had gone missing. And since Aisha was one of the newer employees, fingers had unfairly pointed at her. "I'll talk to them," Rayyan said firmly. "No," Aisha shook her head. "It's not that simple. They said if I can't prove I didn't do it, they'll involve the police." Rayyan's fists clenched. He knew Aisha wouldn't steal, yet he also understood that proving innocence wasn't always easy. Their family couldn't afford a lawyer, and the thought of his sister suffering over something unjust filled him with anger. That night, Rayyan barely slept. The image of Aisha's worried face haunted him. He knew he had to act. His mind raced with thoughts, confronting her boss, finding evidence, anything to clear her name. The next morning, Aisha found her brother already dressed and ready to leave. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To fix this," he said simply. "Rayyan, please, don't get into trouble for me." He turned back, giving her a reassuring smile. "You're my sister. I'd do anything for you." Aisha knew better than to argue. Rayyan had always been her shield, standing up for her when she was bullied at school, walking her home when she was afraid, and now risking himself to protect her again. That morning, as Rayyan walked out the door, Rayyan returned home later that evening, his face tight with frustration. He had spoken to Aisha's employer, but things hadn't gone well. The manager refused to believe her innocence, claiming there was no evidence to clear her. Worse still, they had threatened to report her by the end of the week if the missing items weren't found. "They're blaming you because it's easier than finding the truth," Rayyan said bitterly, "but I won't let them ruin your life." Aisha sat quietly, her fingers trembling. "I should have been more careful," she whispered. "No," Rayyan cut in. "This isn't your fault." That night, Rayyan couldn't sleep. He lay awake, replaying every word from the meeting. Something wasn't adding up. He remembered the manager mentioning a delivery boy who had been near the storage room the same day. It clicked. Someone else had been there. The next morning, Rayyan returned to the store, quietly waiting outside. Hours passed before he spotted the delivery boy leaving. Without hesitation, Rayyan followed him down the street. The boy turned into an alley, and Rayyan quickened his pace. "Hey!" Rayyan called out. The boy froze. His eyes widened with panic before he turned and bolted. Rayyan's heart pounded as he chased him through the narrow streets. The boy ducked behind a fence, but Rayyan grabbed his arm before he could slip away. "Why are you running?" Rayanne demanded. I didn't mean to, the boy stammered. I took it because they weren't paying me enough. Rayanne's grip tightened. You let my sister take the blame for this. I didn't think they'd blame her, the boy said, his voice shaky. I'll give it back. Just please, don't tell the police. Rayanne's anger burned, but he knew what mattered most was clearing Aisha's name. You're coming with me, he said firmly. Later that day, Rayanne walked back into the store with the delivery boy trailing behind him. The manager's expression hardened as they stepped inside. Tell him, Rayanne ordered. The boy stammered out a confession, pulling the stolen items from his bag. The manager's face flushed with embarrassment, and without apology, he simply muttered, I suppose that clears things up. Rayanne didn't waste his breath arguing. He grabbed Aisha's hand and led her out of the store. As they reached the street, Aisha's eyes welled with tears. You didn't have to do all that, she said softly. Yes, I did, Rayanne replied. You're my sister. Aisha smiled, but it was shaky. You always keep your promises. Rayanne gave her a small smile in return. And I always will. The trouble should have ended there, but things took a turn that no one expected. Aisha's manager, still angry over being embarrassed, spread rumors that her family had pressured the delivery boy to confess. Whispers turned into accusations, and soon people in their neighborhood began questioning their family's honesty. Late one evening, as Rayanne walked home, he noticed two unfamiliar men lingering near their house. They spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing toward the door. Alarmed, Rayanne ducked behind a parked car, watching them closely. The men eventually moved down the street, but their presence left Rayanne uneasy. When he stepped inside, his face was tense. Aisha noticed immediately. What's wrong? She asked. Nothing, Rayanne replied. Just stay home for now, all right? The next night, the same men returned. This time, they didn't just linger, they knocked on the door. Rayanne answered, stepping outside to face them. One of the men smirked. You think you're clever, the man sneered. Sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Rayanne's fists clenched. If you have a problem, take it up with me. Leave my family out of it. The man's smile faded. This isn't over. When Rayanne returned inside, Aisha stood by the door, her face pale. What's going on? It's fine, Rayanne said, forcing a calm tone. I'll take care of it. But Aisha knew better. Fear crept in, and Rayanne could see it in her eyes. Listen to me, he said firmly. If anything happens, you grab Sammy and go to Grandma's house. Don't ask questions, just go. The next evening, the tension hit its peak. Rayanne was still at work when the same men returned. This time, they didn't wait to be noticed. They started banging on the door. Open up, one of them shouted. Aisha grabbed Sammy's hand. We have to go, she whispered. But what about Rayanne? Sammy asked, his voice shaking. We'll meet him later, she promised, pulling him toward the back door. As they hurried down the alley behind their home, they heard footsteps closing in. There they are, a voice shouted. Run. Aisha cried. Sammy's breath was ragged, his hand tightening around hers as they sprinted through the narrow streets. Turning corner after corner, they searched for a safe place to hide. Aisha's heart pounded as she spotted a small shop still open. She ducked inside with Sammy just moments before their pursuers reached the corner. The shopkeeper glanced at them with concern, but said nothing. Aisha held her breath, gripping Sammy close as the footsteps faded away. We can't go home yet, she whispered. Not until Rayanne comes for us. Sammy's voice trembled. He'll find us, right? He will, Aisha said, her voice stronger this time. He always does. Rayanne rushed home to find the front door slightly open and the house unsettlingly quiet. His heart pounded as he called out for his family. No answer. He checked each room, finding nothing but overturned chairs and a broken picture frame on the floor. Panic hit him like a wave. He grabbed his phone and dialed Aisha. The call rang endlessly before going to voicemail. Frustrated, he tried again. Still nothing. He felt like the walls were closing in. Then, as he turned toward the kitchen, he noticed a note on the table. In hurried handwriting, it read, "Grandma's house." Relief flooded him, but it didn't last. His mind raced. If those men had followed them, his family wasn't safe yet. Without wasting a second, Rayen grabbed his keys and sped toward his grandmother's house. Halfway there, his phone rang. Aisha's voice came through, shaken but clear. "We're not at Grandma's," she whispered. "They were following us. I didn't know what to do." Rayen's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Where are you now?" "A small shop near the train station," she said. "We're hiding in the back." "Stay there," Rayen instructed. "I'm on my way." He reached the area in minutes, but as he neared the shop, his stomach sank. One of the men from earlier stood across the street, scanning the area. Rayen parked out of sight and slipped into the shadows. Carefully, he moved closer, his eyes locked on the man's every movement. When the man turned his back, Rayen rushed to the shop's side entrance. He knocked softly, and a moment later, Aisha cracked the door open. Seeing her face, tired, worried, but safe, brought him instant relief. "Let's go," Rayen whispered. They slipped out the back and into the narrow alley. Rayen kept Sammy close, gripping his shoulder firmly. Aisha followed closely, her eyes flicking over every shadow. They moved quietly, but before they could reach the car, footsteps echoed behind them. "There they are." "Run!" Rayen shouted. They sprinted down the street, dodging through alleyways and cutting across side roads. The sound of footsteps kept pace behind them. Sammy tripped, but Rayen caught him before he fell. "Go," Rayen urged. "Don't stop." Finally, they reached a busy intersection, blending into the crowd. The men, now far behind, stopped searching and turned back. Rayen kept moving until they reached the car, not daring to breathe until they were safely inside. That night, they returned home together. Their grandmother cried when she saw them, pulling them into a hug that seemed to last forever. Their mother's tears followed soon after, her relief overwhelming her. "I was so scared," Aisha whispered. "I know," Rayen said softly, "but you're safe now." Sammy looked up at him. "You said you'd take care of us. And you did." Rayen smiled faintly and ruffled his hair. "I always will." In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal, but the fear still lingered. Rayen remained alert, checking the locks twice every night and keeping a watchful eye on the streets. Aisha tried to move past the experience, but Rayen could see the worry that hadn't quite left her eyes. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, a knock at the door startled them. Rayen stood up immediately, his muscles tense. "I'll get it," he said firmly. Opening the door, he found a man in a dark jacket, but this time, it wasn't one of the thugs. It was the delivery boy from the store, the one who had confessed to stealing. He stood there awkwardly, clutching an envelope. I wanted to say thank you," the boy stammered, "for not going to the police. I know I don't deserve your kindness." Rayen's expression remained firm, but the boy's sincerity softened his guard. "I found another job," the boy continued. "I wanted to give this to your family as a way to make things right." He held out the envelope. "We're not taking your money," Rayen said. "It's not just money," the boy replied. "I told my new boss about what happened, and he spoke to Aisha's old manager. They're admitting they were wrong. They're willing to apologize if she wants to return." Rayen's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. When Aisha heard the news, her face lit up, not because she wanted her old job back, but because it felt like a piece of her dignity had been restored. "I don't need the job," she said softly. But hearing them admit the truth, that's enough. The following weekend, the family visited their grandmother's house for dinner. Laughter filled the air as Sammy played cards with her, grinning proudly every time he won. Their mother hummed quietly in the kitchen, her voice light with joy. Aisha sat beside Rayanne on the porch, the cool evening breeze brushing past them. You know, she said thoughtfully, when we were running that night, I was scared, but I wasn't afraid of getting caught. I was afraid I wouldn't see you again. Rayanne glanced at her, surprised by her words. You're always protecting us, Aisha continued. But I realized that night, I need to protect you too. Weeks passed, and life began to feel normal again. Rayanne picked up extra shifts, determined to build a stronger future for his family. Aisha, though no longer at her old job, found comfort in helping their grandmother with small catering orders, spending her days cooking and laughing in the kitchen. Sammy, ever the lively one, kept their home filled with jokes and mischief, bringing warmth to even the quietest moments. One evening, as Rayanne returned home from work, he noticed a familiar figure waiting outside their house, one of the men who had chased Aisha and Sammy. Rayanne's heart tightened, but this time the man stood alone with his hands in his pockets, looking uneasy rather than threatening. What do you want? Rayanne asked coldly as he approached. I'm not here to cause trouble, the man muttered. I didn't know things would go that far. We were just trying to scare you, but those kids, I didn't want them involved. Rayanne stared at him, unsure whether to believe him. I heard what you did, the man continued, clearing your sister's name, making sure that boy told the truth. You've got guts. He paused, then added quietly, I respect that. Rayanne's guard didn't lower. If you're finished, you should go. The man nodded. Fair enough, he said, turning to leave. But listen, you've made enemies. People don't forget things like this. Watch your back. Rayanne watched him disappear down the street, unsure whether the warning was meant to help or threaten. Either way, it didn't matter. He knew protecting his family would always be his first priority. That night, as they sat together for dinner, Rayanne kept scanning the windows, listening for unfamiliar sounds outside. Aisha noticed his restlessness. They won't come back, she said quietly. You've done enough. Rayanne didn't answer right away. I just want to be sure, he finally said. You've always been sure, she reminded him. That's what keeps us strong. For the first time in weeks, Rayanne allowed himself to relax. The weight on his chest eased just enough for him to breathe freely. Later that evening, as Aisha finished cleaning the kitchen, she found a small note tucked under the fruit basket. It was written in Sammy's handwriting. To my brother Rayanne, my hero. She smiled softly and folded the paper, slipping it into her pocket. Rayanne didn't know about the note, but he didn't need to. Deep down, he knew what mattered most. His family was safe, and that was all he ever wanted.